All right, so our next two speakers, super interesting. First of all, it kind of got turned around. We were going to just hear exclusively from Dave McCormick. However, what a surprise we have. Reporter from the New York Post, Washington Examiner, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Salena Zito is here. Salena, I guess you can come out. And she's going to be having a conversation today with something I think we all stand for in Pennsylvania and what is needed, a problem solver. So please welcome Dave McCormick.
Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know, this is David McCormick. He is the former CEO of an investment firm, also a military veteran, and a native Yinzer. Grew up in Washington, Pennsylvania, and then went across the state to a farm in Bloomsburg. And also ran for U.S. Senate last year, in case you didn't forget. This close, just a scooch. We're going to be talking today sort of about his book and what his thoughts are about sort of the current state in the country. But I think I'd be remiss, David, if I didn't ask you first about the indictment of President Trump yesterday.
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Salena. Thanks for doing this, and nice to see lots of friends here today. I mean, I think we haven't seen what the indictment is, but I think it's obvious that this is a highly politicized attack on the former president that's made by a partisan district attorney. And the reason we know that is this case has been floating around for 6 years. The predecessor of the current district attorney didn't prosecute it. The Justice Department didn't prosecute it. And the FEC didn't prosecute it. And the reason this is such a big deal is we got to have trust in our judicial system and believe it's fair and that it's going to treat everybody the same, even a former president. And so that's why it's a dark day.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So David's book, Superpower in Peril. I almost said pearl. The thing, before I even opened the book, the thing that caught my eye, and I did a review of it in the New York Post, but the thing that caught my eye as soon as I picked up the book was this quote from Mark Levin. And everyone knows who Mark Levin is, right? Yeah, a little bit, right? I'm going to use this because I can't remember anything anymore. And this is what Levin said. He said, in Superpower in Peril, David McCormick answers the most important question of our time. How do we save America from the forces that want to tear it apart? This book is a must-read for all who care about the fight for our republic. Those are pretty powerful words. What's he talking about?
Well, the book started before Senator Toomey even said he wasn't running for the Senate. So I started writing the book because I thought the country was headed in the wrong direction, that we were in decline, economic decline, $31 trillion of debt, record high inflation, the fact that most Americans won't have the American dream that they had hoped for their kids. But we're also in national security decline with this huge threat from China. But most concerning, we're in spiritual decline, where our institutions are being undermined by leadership, a progressive ideology that's hijacking our schools, our businesses, even our military. The Army, which I served in, introduced its climate change strategy under Joe Biden before it introduced its warfighting strategy. So we're headed in the wrong direction. But the whole purpose of the book is that decline is an option, and so is renewal. It just depends on what we do. And so this book is the What We Should Do book. And I essentially make the argument for educating our people, confronting China, and securing America. And the book is very ominous because I think we're at a crisis point for our country, but it's also optimistic in the sense that we can do this. We've been here before, and we just require the best ideas, which we have, and the right leadership to take it forward. And so even though I'm very worried about our future, I'm also optimistic that America will find a way.
That's great. I'd highly recommend the book. The book is really, really good. It's a very good blueprint. And I want to talk to you about the aspirational part of your book. One of the most important things that we saw in 2016 when Make America Great came out, before the left and has has sort of hijacked it and called it MAGA and used it as a slang. Make America Great Again is aspirational. It's about being part of something bigger than yourselves. And I think you really touch on that in every step of the way, beginning with your childhood. And I wonder if you could just introduce the audience a little bit about your path to success in life.
Yeah, well, I wrote the book as somebody who feels blessed. Like, you know, I grew up in Bloomsburg, as you said. I never imagined that I would have the great opportunities I've had, but only in America are those opportunities available. So I went to West Point, served in the military, came to Pittsburgh, ran a company, went and ran another company. So I've had this blessing. And, you know, there's this great quote from the great conservative William F. Buckley, which is this idea that citizenship in America is a privilege to be part of the best country in the history of the world, an exceptional America, but it's also a responsibility, where it's only going to stay that way if we all do our part. And that's one of the things I worry about with our kids. If our kids aren't taught that America's special, that America's exceptional, then they don't wake up thinking they got to do their part to keep it that way. It's not just going to keep going. And so I think that's part of the crisis, is that people don't feel this notion of responsibility or a direction to take the country. And the reason I'm optimistic is, you know, we've lived through this before. And I talk about in the book being in the late 70s, which many of you will remember, when we were at double-digit inflation. It was stagflation. It was like 15% inflation. The economy was in recession. We had gas lines around the block, odd days and even days before you could go get gas. And we had Desert One, where we had, you know, we lost 8 soldiers and sailors and airmen on the sands of Iran, a lot like Afghanistan, where it was just a disaster, a disgrace. And then 4 years later, it was morning in America. And I was at West Point walking across those beautiful walkways, and you could see the optimism in America. And our economy was back on track with good pro-growth policies. And our military was on the rise, and that military ended the Cold War 6 years later. So leadership matters. I'm not saying Ronald Reagan's policies are right for this moment, but leadership makes all the difference. And what Reagan did at the time was appealed to a huge part of the population that had been left behind. And that's what President Trump did in 2016. He tapped into those people that had, so many of our population, half of our country, that hadn't been advantaged over the last 20 years. And where they had real income that stayed flat, and they had fentanyl in their backyards, and the China crisis was outsourcing jobs. So we're at a moment where we have to have a plan, a vision for moving forward, and the right leadership to take it forward. And so I don't quite see our path in terms of how that's going to come together. The book is meant to be the starting point, but I'm optimistic we'll find our way.
Right, and let's just step back and talk about the military for a minute. You made a really good point. In the 70s, you talked about stagnation, which is very similar to the inflationary problems we're going through right now. But also, our military at that time, that was post-Vietnam War. The military-civilian relationship at that time was probably at the lowest, I think, probably ever. And do you see a similarity now in terms of recruitment?
I'm really worried. I'm really worried about our military. I mean, you know, throughout the book, I feel one of the great privileges I had was to be in the military, to be part of that, because it brings our country together. You know, I have a kid from rural Alabama in my platoon. I've got an African-American kid from inner city Newark. I've got a platoon sergeant from Puerto Rico, who kind of keeps me in track. We never talked about, you know, politics. We talked about each other and the future of the future, you know, common purpose. So the military brings our society together in lots of ways. And right now, I think the military is at risk on a lot of levels. So the Biden budget plan is essentially a cut in defense because it doesn't even keep up with inflation. And at a time when we've got a crisis from China, we've got a crisis with Russia, we've got challenges with Iran around the world, North Korea. I mean, if there's ever a time in our lifetimes that we're at risk, this is that moment. But beyond that, there's the cultural deterioration, the wokeness that's become sort of a rallying cry for our military. So that's taken more priority than actually being ready for the fight we have today. And then we have a recruiting crisis. And the recruiting crisis, I think, is a byproduct of that wokeness, where people don't see the military as a place where they can succeed on merit. And it's also a problem with our culture where kids don't see the military as a place where they can promote America. And so it's a real problem. And with most problems, it starts at the top. So we have the wrong president, in my opinion, and the wrong leadership in the Pentagon. And that's what we need to change in 2024. And trust me, they're watching. The Chinese are watching, the Russians are watching. They saw the disaster in Afghanistan. They saw the weakness with Ukraine and Russia and the Nord Stream 2, where we approved the Russian pipeline to Ukraine. They saw the weakness with the Chinese surveillance balloon. Whenever there's weakness, just go back to the playground, right? Some basic rules of life you learn on the playground. If people sense weakness, the bully's going to proceed and push. And the world feels weakness right now in America, in our leadership, and that's what we need to fix.
Let's expand a little bit on China. We have a lot of problems with China. It's not just a spy balloon. Their military capabilities are beginning to supersede ours. And I wonder if you could just talk about that, but just also just the intellectual property that they steal from us.
It's and I try to capture this in the book, but I think the best way to say it in one sentence is China has a plan. China has a plan to dominate the world, and we don't have a plan. We literally do not have a plan. And this book is, among other things, a plan. And the plan has two pieces. One part of the plan is go to the gym. So we've gotten flabby, we've gotten weak, right? We need to go to the gym with our education system. We're 22nd in the world in education, in industrialized countries. I mean, America, of all places. We need to go to the gym in terms of technology leadership, and there's a bunch of policies I recommend to do that. We need to have a strategy for data and big tech, right? Data and big tech is like the future of power, and we don't have a strategy. So we need to have good policies, but then we need to confront China abroad. And I give President Trump credit in the book, where I think there was a lot of sleepwalking for the 15 years preceding 2016. And I think Trump, to his credit, reset how America thinks about China as an adversary. But we need to have a comprehensive plan for dealing with it. And so what I essentially say is we need to decouple strategically. So we need to bring home semiconductors. We need to bring home pharmaceuticals. I'd admit, I didn't realize until COVID that we were so dependent on China for pharmaceuticals. It's unbelievable, right? Or semiconductors. 90% of the semiconductors in the world are manufactured 90 miles from mainland China. The reason, if you ordered a new pickup truck in the last 18 months, the reason it took so long was because semiconductors. We're dependent on outside the United States for semiconductors. So one, we need to strategically decouple. Two, we need to hold China accountable for COVID. Can you believe we still didn't get to the bottom, right? And this is the fact this is a good example of where social media and liberal media don't give a fair airing to actually what's going on. The idea that the Wuhan lab, which researches such things as COVID, and the Wuhan virus, which originated in Wuhan, would somehow be connected, was presented as a conspiracy theory, right? When we now know that our intelligence services have thought that's a real possibility. But for 3 years, we've been, so we need to hold China accountable for that. We need to hold China accountable for intellectual property theft, which is a huge problem. Then the third thing we need to do is we need to restrict investment from America that directly goes against our interest. And today, as we speak, there are technology companies in the Silicon Valley, venture capitalists, that are investing in artificial intelligence companies in China that work with the Chinese military, the PLA, and the Chinese Communist Party. Like, it's madness that we would allow that to happen. Now, I'm not saying, and some will argue with me on this, I'm not saying that, the parts manufacturer, machine shop in Lancaster, Pennsylvania that I met during the campaign that exports certain parts to China for Harley-Davidsons, I'm not saying we should restrict that, but the things that actually feed China's ability to confront us, we need to stop that, and we need to stop it immediately. And the final thing we need to do is we need to be smart about our allies. The only people that should be more worried about China than us right now are the Japanese and the Australians and those people that live right next door. And so there's a way to bring an alliance together that really pushes back on China. But what's it take? It takes that thing I keep talking about. It takes leadership, and we haven't had leadership to do that, and that's what we need to change.
2 more questions. One more. What about China? the relationships and deals they've just brokered with Saudi Arabia, I mean, that should should make everyone incredibly concerned, but not just Saudi Arabia, also with Russia.
Yeah, those two data points, if there's nothing else that you hear from me today, think about that. I keep saying China has a plan. What's our plan? Everywhere you see that plan, everywhere. There was just an article a couple weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal that talked about 44 key technologies for economic power and military power. This Australian think tank did a study. China was in the lead in 37 of the 44. They have a plan. They have a plan for alliances around the world. Their support of Russia is a direct affront to America. That's the purpose of that. Their partnership with Saudi Arabia and Iran is directly targeted at exploiting the weakness of the Biden administration, the fact that if you're Saudi Arabia right now, you're saying, I'm not sure I can count on those guys in America anymore, and I've got to hedge my bets. That's what bad leadership brings, and that's what lack of a plan brings. And so that's what the book is trying to do, is to say, hey, listen, let's wake up. You know, we're in crisis. It's okay, we can get out of this, but it requires leadership and a plan, and you know, until I see a better plan, I'm arguing for this one.
And that lack of trust in the Middle East, in particular, goes back to what happened in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you know, if you think about the catalyst for me thinking about running for the Senate, you know, we had talked about it and decided, you know, probably not the right thing for us. Sitting in front of that TV, watching those wire fences come down, watching Bagram Air Force Base, where you have a bunch of people with grocery carts running out with our military equipment, watching the Afghanis fall out of the wheel wells, out of those airplanes, this is not the America we know. This is not the America we know. So we had to, I think we're close on time. We had to bring it to an end.
I'm so bad. Okay, last question. You all live in Pennsylvania. I'm a Pennsylvania reporter. Are you thinking about running?
Definitely thinking about running. You don't...
You guys like that?
We haven't decided yet. There's a couple things going on. I mean, when you lose by 900 votes and you're motivated to try to serve, it's not like you lose the motivation to serve. So I'm definitely trying to figure out how to best serve. And then there's this problem when you're a former CEO, you sit around and if you're not in charge of anything, you start to give advice. So I've been giving advice to my 6 girls and my wife on a range of topics, and there was a moment recently where my wife looked across the lunch table and said, "You must get bleep a job." So I got to figure out what's next. But thanks for asking.
Everybody.
All right, thank you.